Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here. Got another CHP special episode for you. Back in 2013, some of you might remember, I produced a show covering the history of the Chinese in Mexico. That was CHP 123. A lot of the feedback I got from listeners was that they had no idea about any of this history. Tales of the Chinese diaspora come in all shapes and sizes, and their history took place in all the countries of the world. So to continue this history of the Chinese in Mexico, I'm very happy to introduce Hugo Wong and to have him on the program because his family was part of that history that I presented to you in that episode back in the good old days in 2013. Hugo Wong is an author and an entrepreneur who grew up between Paris and Mexico City. And since 1995, he has lived intermittently in Beijing. And Hugo's also a longtime investor in China and Mexico, helping clients to establish Sino-foreign joint ventures, including China's first investment bank. He built his career in emerging markets investment at major Hong Kong, London, and New York financial institutions. And his book that came out a year ago in 2023 is entitled America's Lost Chinese, The Rise and Fall of a Migrant Family Dream. The book covers a history that spans a century from the 1860s to the 1960s. So all the way from London, welcome to the CHP, Hugo Wong.
Thanks for having me, Laszlo.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You know, we got a lot to cover, so let's start with the two main figures from the book, your ancestors, Wang Fun-chuk and Liang Hing. How did they make it from the Four Counties region of Guangdong province to San Francisco and then to Mexico after the U.S. exclusion laws?
So both Fun-chuk and Hing migrated to the U.S. in the 1870s when they were 12 and 14 years old, fleeing poverty and natural disasters in China. The fact that they left their native Canton province so young and traveled alone touched me, motivating me to write their story. Although coming from the same region in China, Fun-chuk and Hing had different backgrounds. Fun-chuk was from a wealthier village, had attended primary school. Upon arriving in San Francisco, he was fortunate to be among the first Chinese in the U.S. to attend a missionary school, the first Chinese church in America. The church was run by Reverend Loomis, who could speak some Chinese, as he had been a missionary in China. At the time, some Americans believed that the U.S. had a manifest destiny to do missionary work, not only in China, but also among the Chinese migrants at home. The Reverend and his family acted like a foster family for Fun-chuk, giving him both Christian and American values during his 6 years with them, lessons which would prove valuable to him all his life. By contrast, he came from a poorer family, had only a rudimentary education, and had bought his boat ticket to America on credit. When he arrived in San Francisco, he hence had to work to repay his loan. Hing worked first in a laundry. Conditions were harsh, as everything was done by hand. He later worked in railroad construction near the Mexican border. Less than 10 years after arriving in the U.S., due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, they were both among the first Chinese to enter Mexico. Both had tried to stay in the U.S., but were unable to secure residency permits. Fun-chuk and Hing later became friends, while living parallel lives. Both became successful businessmen in Mexico and married Mexican women, each having 10 children, helping their integration into Mexican society. The experience of my ancestors was hence marked by a good acculturation in Mexico, but the successes created also resentment because of what they had achieved. Fun-chuk started working in his teens as a hotel bellboy in San Francisco, but his first real job was working as a cook for Chinese railroad workers close to the Mexican border, a profession which doubled as well with that of labor organizer, This was possible because Funchuk was one of the few who could speak and write in Chinese and English. U.S. railroad and mining employers needed bilingual foremen like him to manage their Chinese workforce. Later in his career, with the help of local and Chinese politicians as well as U.S. business partners, and using capital from his extended family, Funchuk built a business empire in Mexico, which comprised large farms, a hotel chain, stores and laundries, being also behind the most prosperous Chinese colony in Mexico, in the city of Torreon, with its own international bank and even a tramway company. Funchuk became known then as the richest Chinese in Mexico, something that would have been difficult to achieve without his early education in the United States. While facing difficulties to enter the US throughout his life, because of his education, he always kept a kind disposition towards the US and had American business partners in most of his businesses, helping them expand in Mexico. Despite his humble beginnings, Liang Hing became a rich merchant too, introducing Chinese art products to Mexicans for the first time. At the beginning, he started selling his products door to door, like was customary in China. But later, he opened Chinese art stores around the country. Unlike Funchuk, Hing did not compete against Mexican businessmen, which later helped him when anti-Chinese sentiment grew in Mexico. Despite the Mexican Revolution and the anti-Chinese violence that ensued, Funchuk and Hing were among the very few Chinese migrants to Mexico who decided to and managed to stay in Mexico, the vast majority of their compatriots either later leaving voluntarily or being deported out of the country. Their experiences between three cultures and the personalities they befriended make their lives quite unique.
And so under what circumstances did your mother leave China?
Yes, so my grandfather, Funchuk's nephew, was born and educated in China, while my grandmother was born in Mexico, the product of a mixed-race union between Hing and a Mexican woman, making her one of the first Eurasians in America. My grandparents met in Mexico in the 1920s, where my grandfather was visiting his Chinese family settled there. My grandfather had arrived from China in 1924 to study at the University of Pennsylvania. In those days, U.S. university graduates from China, even from top institutions, could not find jobs in neither the U.S. nor in Mexico, both due to anti-Chinese exclusion and the economic crisis in those two countries. For those reasons, after graduation in 1930, like many other bright Chinese, my grandfather decided to go back to China and start his career as an architect in Shanghai. In 1931, Shanghai was then a booming city in need of Western-trained architects like him. My grandparents loved their existence in Shanghai International Concessions, a cosmopolitan and welcoming migrant city. In Shanghai, my US-educated grandfather and my mixed grandmother, after having found exclusion in both the US and Mexico, finally found a place they could call home. In 1938, my grandfather passed away after a painful disease, and the Japanese invasion forced my widowed and heartbroken grandmother to flee with her 3 children and return back to Mexico, her country of birth, just a few weeks before the Japanese invaded the international concessions of Shanghai. Hence, my own mother arrived in Mexico when she was only 3 years old and grew up there as a Chinese refugee, but one without any knowledge of the Chinese language and only with scant memories of her country of birth. By then, most of the first wave of Chinese migrants to Mexico, which had included Funchuk and Hing, had already left because of the anti-Chinese violence, which meant that my mother would grow without many Chinese around her. The only links to her Chinese past were now buried in a trunk full of old, yellowed photographs and documents. At each generation, the story of my family has been one of exile, first for my great-grandparents from China to the US, and then to Mexico in the late 19th century, then for my grandparents at the start of the century, back and forth between China, the US, and Mexico before the war, and finally my own mother from Mexico to the US and then to Europe after the war.
How did all the anti-Chinese violence and the 1882 Chinese exclusion law affect the dynamic of Chinese who migrated to Mexico? Perhaps you can touch on the pre-1880s Chinese presence in Mexico.
Yes, sure. So with more abundant and cheaper vessels available to carry migrants from Hong Kong to San Francisco, the number of Chinese arriving in the U.S. reached its peak around 1880, just around when my ancestors had arrived. American people worried then that California would become a huge Chinese colony. Chinese were also blamed by Americans for lacking democratic ideals, working for lower wages than whites, men in quasi-slavery, and women in prostitution. In 1877, 2 years before his arrival, Fun Chuk witnessed the anti-Chinese riots of San Francisco, organized by a local American labor organization, when many Chinese laundries were set on fire. Like in other places in the world, it was then the poorest workers who first opposed those newly arrived immigrants, fearful for their jobs and their salaries. In 1882, this led to the passing by the US Congress of the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning Chinese immigration, the first legislation of its kind. My ancestors witnessed riots and suffered from physical violence. The Chinese community living in constant fear, with killings, riots, and expulsions happening all over the Pacific coast. Americans were taking immigration matters into their own hands, and this violence continued until the end of the 19th century, when the US government established a well-staffed and organized immigration department. As a consequence of that legislation and the violence that went with it, Chinese migrants were redirected from the US to Mexico and other southern destinations. Unlike the US, Mexico had an almost non-existent immigration service, and on the contrary, started welcoming Chinese migrants to serve as laborers for its booming economy, like the US had done 20 years earlier. It is estimated that more than 60,000 Chinese entered Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th century, many of them coming from the US. But 40 years later, only 5,000 of them remained. Interestingly, attracted by higher wages, and despite the anti-Chinese sentiment, many of those Chinese migrants to Mexico would later try to re-enter the US illegally, becoming the first US illegal aliens. Some US senators called then for the building of a Chinese wall at the Mexico border to stop the illegal immigration of the Chinese. The desert south of Mexicali, near the US border, was also called the Desert of the Chinese, for the many migrants who had lost their lives trying to cross it. It is worth mentioning that those Chinese entering Mexico at the end of the 19th century were not the first Chinese migrants in the country. Since the 17th century and lasting 200 years, the rising appetite from China for American silver had resulted in the so-called Manila Galleon trade, where China exchanged its porcelains, silks, and tea for that precious metal. Unknown to many, well before London and Amsterdam, Mexico became then the first globalized city in the world, where products from 3 continents were exchanged. Ironically, this old trade out of China reflects a similar pattern today, when the West continues to buy Chinese products in exchange of not silver anymore, but foreign currencies. Thus, the first Chinese and Filipino migrants arrived in Mexico 300 years ago, and an estimated 50,000 of them stayed in the country, more than a century before Fun Chuk and Hing arrived.
That was mostly in Acapulco, wasn't it? Or was it also Mexico City?
Yes, they all. I mean, the main port where that trade happened was Acapulco. But then all the richest Mexicans lived in Mexico, so all those products then were moved to the capital.
So, what were the similarities between the Chinese experience in America and Chinese in Mexico during this period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
So yeah, that's a good question. Actually, there were a lot of similarities. In both the US and Mexico, Chinese migrants were first welcome to develop the economy. In the US, the Burlingame Treaty of 1868 encouraged the free migration of Chinese, and so did in Mexico the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce with China of 1888. However, as the number of Chinese migrants increased and economic conditions worsened in both countries, attitudes began to change. This led to exclusion of the Chinese, as early as the 1880s in the United States, and after the Revolution of 1911 in the case of Mexico. This exclusion took the form of violence and killings in both countries, like in Tacoma, Washington, Los Angeles, or Rock Springs, Wyoming in the US, and in the city of Torreon in Mexico. In both countries, forced deportations of Chinese also followed, especially as both countries started to build better staffed immigration services. In both the US and Mexico, Chinese migrants were in principle allowed to buy land, marry local women, and exercise any trade they wanted. But there were geographical exceptions in both the US and Mexico. Like in California and in most southern US states, there were restrictions against the Chinese marrying, buying land, and exercising some trades. Some of those lasted well into the 1960s. The same happened in the northern Mexican states of Sonora and Sinaloa in the 1920s in Mexico. For that reason, mixed marriages in the US were limited to the Northeast, while being more widespread in Mexico, a situation which obviously is different today. It is estimated that a tenth to a fifth of the Chinese ended up marrying Mexican women. Another reason for the more mixed marriages is that Mexico was already a mixed race country, with the mestizos between Indian and Spaniards already accounting for more than half of the population. This meant Mexicans were simply more used to mixed marriages than in the US. However, those marriages were shunned by Mexican society. The most notable economic difference between the two countries was that in the US, wages were much higher than in Mexico. For that reason, many more Chinese migrants were happy to live as laborers in the US. On the contrary, in Mexico, at least before the revolution, more than 30% of the migrants became merchants, selling their products to the Mexicans, a much larger percentage than in the US. Before the Mexican Revolution, as observed by the Chinese ambassador in Washington, the Chinese in Mexico enjoyed relatively higher social position, but this, of course, would change dramatically over the following years.
So can you talk about the impact of Porfirio Diaz on the Chinese in Mexico, and maybe just touch on who he was in Mexican history?
So Porfirio Diaz was president of Mexico for almost 30 years, from 1884 to 1911, ruling the country as a dictator, but in his view, a benevolent one. Although of Indian blood on his mother's side, he was prejudiced and believed that progress could only happen if the Mexican workforce and society became whiter. This was a typical case of state racism. Like others in his government, he thought as well that the Mexican population was deficient in size and capacity to exploit the country's richness, and that only the fittest would survive. Diaz hence favored foreign investment and foreign immigration, as well as the rich industrialists and landowners of the country. At the same time, he maintained the majority of the poor Mexican workers under tight police control. During his regime, the country became wealthier, economic growth outpacing all other Latin American countries. But it also became a more unequal country, leading to the Mexican Revolution of 1911. Workers' wages were 1/15 of US wages, working conditions in Mexico not being different to those of slaves. All land was owned by the richest 2% of the country, or only 800 families, while 90% of the population was poor, illiterate, and subsisting day to day, working 16-hour shifts. Porfirio Diaz wanted to encourage European immigration, but he failed to attract white settlers willing to accept the low wages of the Mexicans.
Not to mention the heat of the Sonoran Desert.
That's true as well. And so for that reason, he turned to the Chinese, welcoming them in Mexico as laborers. That did not mean that the Chinese were welcome to settle permanently, but many did nonetheless, while later quitting their jobs as laborers, marrying local women, and becoming merchants, like Funchug and Hing would do. Unlike the US, Porfirio Diaz did not make of Mexico a country of immigration. There are only 120,000 foreigners then in the whole of Mexico, compared to the more than 30 million Europeans having migrated to the US in the previous century, making their success more obvious, but also the Chinese much more visible. Although the Chinese were needed for Mexican agriculture and rail construction, Mexican society and government remained racist towards them. The Chinese were then called motores de sangre, meaning blood engines by the Mexicans, showing their low status in Mexican society. Yet, they are also considered better workers than the local Indians or mestizos, although not as ideal as Europeans. This created a lot of resentments from the Mexican lower classes, similar to what happened for the Chinese in the US 3 decades earlier. A common complaint and criticism of the Mexicans at the time was against the widespread belief that Mexicans were people who knew less and were less able than other nations of Earth. A Mexican industrialist even wrote that foreign companies were behaving like the conquerors of a defeated country.
What role did the U.S. play in pre-revolutionary Mexico, and how did the Chinese diaspora in Mexico thrive as transnational agents across the U.S. border?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. The US played a very important role in pre-revolutionary Mexico. By 1910, 75,000 Americans were living in Mexico, who for most would leave during and after the Mexican Revolution. The US controlled a quarter of Mexican territory, and Mexico accounted then for 50% of the total US foreign investments abroad. And many Mexican Chinese work for those American companies. William Hearst famously said, "I really don't see what it is to prevent us from owning all of Mexico and running it to suit ourselves." Unlike in China, where the railroad was then seen by the Qing government as a tool for Westerners to subjugate China, in Mexico it was the opposite, with the Mexican government encouraging the construction of a multitude of railway lines connecting Mexico to the United States, many owned by American rail barons like Collis Potter Huntington, who also owned various Mexican mines. Many properties and infrastructure were owned by foreigners who discriminated against local workers. Many Chinese workers who had been rejected by US immigration were then able to work in Mexico for those US corporations, but at lower wages than in the North, an arrangement that seems to please everyone at the time. This is one reason why a majority of Chinese migrants lived in the north of Mexico, close to the US border and to the US multinational companies settled in the country. When the Mexican Revolution started, the Chinese, although not all wealthy, were associated with the rich foreigners for whom they worked, helping them colonize new land from the Indians through construction or agriculture. They hence later became scapegoats in the Mexican Revolution. Others, like Funchuk, decided to use their American connections to do business with US corporations in Mexico. Funchuk, for example, leased various hotels along the railway lines from US rail companies, worked for some time as a US coal mine manager, and also offered services to various foreign companies in Mexico, like in retail or in laundry. He later would partner with Americans to grow its agricultural projects in Mexico. Most Mexican merchants were also running transnational businesses, purchasing their goods from wholesalers across the US-Mexico border, at a time when direct China-Mexico sea routes were not yet developed. It is worth noting that the role of agents and intermediaries that many Chinese played between local Mexicans and American industrialists is similar to the role that many Chinese migrants had played in the many Western colonies in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, Singapore, or Indonesia. Merchants like Funchuk and Hing also kept strong links with their native organizations or guilds, which grouped all the Chinese from the same region in China. Those organizations helped the migrants find work, borrow money, send money back home, and repatriate their corpses to China, or simply source products cheaply. By tapping into those transnational organizations across the border, the Chinese were able to gain a price advantage that their Mexican competitors could not achieve. Chinese grocers also introduced unknown sales techniques in Mexico, like itinerant trade, providing credit to customers, carrying large inventories, and incentivizing customers with free products. Surprisingly, for those reasons, Chinese merchants in Mexico soon managed to build a quasi-monopoly over the grocery trade in all of northern Mexico, creating a relationship of dependence with many Mexicans and a lot of resentment. The Chinese formed a new merchant middle class, which had not existed previously in that rural part of Mexico. Many poor Mexican farmers did not understand how the Chinese had managed to elevate themselves from the position of laborers and farmers to later become merchants, something they were not able to do themselves. The racism in Mexico against the Chinese took then an additional form than in the US, where Chinese workers had only been vilified for stealing the employment of poor Americans. In Mexico, by contrast, the Chinese and other foreigners were also criticized for becoming wealthy and stealing business opportunities from the Mexicans.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
Let's discuss some little-known history here. What impact did Kang You-wei and his protege Liang Qichao have in Chinese-Mexican history? And what role did your family play in this dream Chinese colony they had in Mexico.
So Kong Yue is an interesting character. He was first a Chinese scholar, an educator and a philosopher from Guangdong province, later becoming a civil servant for the late Qing government in Beijing and a politician. He got influenced by some early trips to Hong Kong and Shanghai, when he realized that Western theories could not be ignored, trying to reconcile them with Confucianism and Buddhism. He started writing to the Chinese emperor, becoming his advisor, and launching with him a failed reform attempt in 1898. Many of those reforms mirrored what the Japanese had done earlier. Kong was then condemned to death by slow slicing by Empress Cixi, who opposed those reforms, and he was forced into exile until 1913 after the Chinese Revolution. During his 15 years in exile abroad, he became among the first Chinese intellectuals to analyze how Western societies and governments worked, meeting with industrialists and presidents including Theodore Roosevelt and Porfirio Diaz. Kong feared that China would disappear, becoming a Western colony and losing all sovereignty. He therefore tried to unify the Chinese diaspora, which in a way became his country while in exile. He also believed the mixing of world races would save the world from conflict, and that a global world government should be achieved. In 1920, he felt enthusiastic when the League of Nations was created. While abroad, he formed a political party called the Chinese Empire Reform Association, rallying overseas Chinese from all over the world, which at its peak would count more than 100,000 members. He also created a network of overseas Chinese schools, including one in Mexico, founded with Funchuk. It is telling that the first political parties in China were all born abroad and were founded by Cantonese reformers like Kong Yue and his rival Sun Yat-sen, all influenced by Western modernity and politics. Kong stayed 6 months in Mexico, staying in Funchuk's home. He met with Porfirio Diaz and saw him as a benevolent dictator, not different from a Chinese emperor, believing that Diaz would protect Chinese investments in the country. He also realized that Mexico was a mixed-race country and that the Native Americans originated from Asia, having crossed the Bering Strait 20,000 years ago before populating the American continent. He tried to find similarities between the Aztec language and architecture with the ones of North Asia. In Mexico, Funchuk became the head of Kong's organization and also his business partner. Together, they founded a Chinese colony in the northern city of Torreon, not far from the US border. Kong saw his project as not only political, but also economic. He wanted the Chinese diaspora to become stronger economically, himself sponsoring and raising funds to invest in transportation, property, and banking globally. By doing so, he became in a way an early private equity fund manager. The Chinese colony founded by Kong had a bank, a shipping venture, a tramway company, a school, a newspaper for the local Chinese, and various property investments around the city. Kong dreamed that one day his colony of Torreon would become a model for his vision of a unified world in a friendly and welcoming Mexico.
Best laid plans. So let's discuss the specifics of the May 1911 Torreon massacre. How is this an example of the social engineering project carried out by Porfirio Diaz? How did it affect your family?
Torreon was a boom town at the time. Its population grew from 2,000 people in 1880 to more than 40,000 30 years later. All its inhabitants were therefore migrants. The city was characterized by a large urban proletariat of poor male workers, a small minority of wealthy industrialists, and a large community of foreigners, attracted by its economy, recently built rail links to the US, and advantageous tax rebates. Torreon was called the most American city in Mexico, with a US consulate and 1,500 US citizens. It also had nationals from many other countries, including 700 Chinese. For those reasons, Torreon represented a prime example of Porfirio Diaz's social engineering project in Mexico. So in Torreon, like in other parts of northern Mexico, in addition to the restaurants, laundries, and hotels, the Chinese owned their own farms and controlled and monopolized the food distribution in the entire city. Never in history had a group of Chinese reached such a level of economic influence over a Western population and territory. Funchuk was the owner of one of the largest farms in Torreon, called back then the Chinese Gardens by the local population. As documented by many scholars, it is known that Chinese migrants often transformed the eating habits of the locals by introducing more balanced diets, ones with more vegetables. Unlike most American Chinese settlements at the time, with its employees' barracks or typical Chinese restaurants, laundries, and stores, the Torreon Chinese colony was a unique project, funded by large pools of international Chinese capital and aimed at building large businesses to serve both local and Chinese customers, like the bank, the farms, the tramway company, and the hotels. This was probably one of the first examples of such a Chinese colony in the global south outside of Asia. The Mexican Revolution of 1911 was a popular and very violent uprising which lasted 10 long years, killing more than 1.5 million people, and 1 out of 10 Mexicans. The revolution was mainly driven by nationalism and socialism, but also anti-intellectualism, rejecting the technocrats of the previous regime. Each of those three principles put the Chinese migrants on the wrong side of history, as many had prospered in Mexico, epitomized by the Chinese colony of Torreon. The revolutionary motto became "For the motherland and for the race," rejecting all foreigners, but especially the Chinese, who were so conspicuous. Welcome turned suddenly into rejection and hatred against the Chinese community, who, because of their successes, became the scapegoats of the revolution. In 2 days of May 1911, 303 Chinese, or half of the Chinese population of Torreon, including women and children, were massacred savagely by a mob of 4,000 people, made of released prisoners, revolutionary soldiers recently arrived in the city, and common folks. Torreon was characterized by corporations owned by absentee Chinese capitalists and employing Chinese people exclusively. This was a contrast with the other foreign businesses in Torreon, which employed Mexicans. Like in the case of Funchuk, those Chinese owners did not have their mixed families living in Torreon, and also were blamed for the rampant land speculation and for hoarding merchandise in times of crisis. All these factors had created resentment from the local populace of Torreon. During the looting of Torreon, other foreign communities did not suffer the same, and the Chinese did not offer any resistance either. This massacre was an act of racist mass murder, as explained in independent investigation reports later. This would be the largest single massacre of Chinese in American history. More massacres followed in the following decade, totaling more than thousands of victims across Mexico, creating a reign of terror for the Chinese diaspora. Kong lost one nephew during the massacre, and Funchuk various members of his family. Subsequently, many properties were confiscated by locals, and it would take decades before some money could be recovered. The largest loss the Chinese community suffered in Mexico.
Yeah, it only took a century and a decade, but in 2021, then President Obrador offered a long overdue apology for his country's role in the Torreon massacre. So how did the American and Mexican governments react to the massacre, and what were its consequences?
So when the Torreon massacre happened in 1911, William Taft had been the U.S. president since 1909. He was, unlike his predecessor Theodore Roosevelt, who had negative views of the Chinese and had extended the Chinese Exclusion Act. Taft, who had lived in Asia earlier, held more progressive and friendly views towards China. His government, while maintaining the Exclusion Act in place, also surged a rapprochement with China, partly to balance Japanese ambitions in Asia, the opposite of Roosevelt's earlier policies. Although Torreon did not cause much reaction in the Chinese press, because of the large Chinese investments and population in the city, the Chinese government decided to order an investigation report on the massacre. As Torreon counted a large American population, which, unlike the Chinese, had survived the violence, many of them were now available to serve as witnesses for the report. The Chinese government also used a Washington law firm close to President Taft to conduct that investigation, and its report was intentionally leaked to the US press, making the US audience turn pro-Chinese. At the same time, the Chinese government announced its intention to send to the Gulf of Mexico one of its new war frigates, then in a mission in Cuba. Strangely, this move was well received in the US opinion and press, many commenting that China had finally learned about gunboat diplomacy and was now using it to defend itself. This goes to show how most nations at the time across the globe admired militarism. This threat convinced the Mexican government to agree to pay to the Chinese reparations for the massacre. However, in the following years, as both the Mexican and Chinese government experienced revolutions and regime changes, that compensation was never paid. One of the consequences of the massacres was the loss by Kong Youwei of much of its influence, as many of his followers were disappointed by the abysmal financial performance of his organization, caused by Torreon and by other bad investments in Asia. Kong was then unable to influence the revolution in China, having lost most political power. Maybe things would have turned differently for him and Chinese politics if Torreon had not happened. Reflecting on Torreon and the Mexican Revolution, and still trying to promote a constitutional monarchy in China, Kong predicted that the same way Mexico had an immature political system, China was not ready either for a republican system. Sadly, the ensuing long Chinese Civil War proved him in part correct.
So after all your research and reflection on this subject of Chinese-Mexican history, why was it, do you think, that Chinese immigrants face such intolerance and violence? It seems the Chinese immigrant experience in Mexico sort of rhymes with similar experiences of Chinese immigrants the world over, not just in North America.
Yes, you're very correct to say that, Laszlo. In the history of its diaspora, Chinese migrants have faced violence from their host countries in the Philippines in the 16th to 18th centuries, in Peru and the United States in the 19th century, and finally in Mexico and various Southeast Asian countries in the 20th. There are various reasons behind that violence, although the political situation was quite different in each of those countries. Some common factors have played a role. The most obvious one has been economic competition with the local population, as the Chinese has often been seen as trying to displace them. The Chinese have often been criticized for being too hardworking, slave-like, and competing unfairly, something still true today. A second recurring factor has been the perceived unwillingness from some Chinese to assimilate and mingle with the local populations, preferring to stay among themselves and never losing their allegiance to their homeland. However, this is often an unfair criticism, as this was often the direct consequence of them being segregated, like what had happened in Manila, then under the Spanish crown. But this is also linked to their attachment to their traditions and to the land of their ancestors. For example, the Chinese tradition of exhuming the corpses of their dead to be repatriated to their native village and the reluctance to eat local foods were seen as illustrations of that. These customs were widely followed in Mexico and the US when Funchuk and Hing lived there. However, the Chinese in Mexico, like in many other places from Hawaii to Malacca, have also shown their willingness to mix and assimilate with the local population. One reason being that they often did not bring their Chinese wives with them abroad and sometimes practiced polygamy. In various instances, the Chinese were also seen as potential political threat for the local regimes, which is particularly true in Southeast Asia, like in the Philippines 3 centuries ago, or in Indonesia after World War II, given these countries' relatively closer proximity with China. This was less true in the Americas until recently, but this is now changing with Chinese increasing economic power, something that was not a factor a century ago. One of the most striking illustrations in the book is a detail of Mexico's most iconic and revered painting, one by Diego Rivera, called Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Central, painted in the 1950s. The mural is supposed to illustrate how Mexicans have been exploited over the years, first by the conquistadors, then the church, and finally the foreign capitalists. The mural also depicts a policeman with Chinese evil traits expelling a native Indian from the park, like in the US 50 years earlier when the Chinese were criticized for breaking strikes. The Chinese were again depicted as being on the side of the exploiters and against the common people.
Did Chinese immigrants face any violence elsewhere in Latin America? You mentioned Peru. What happened there?
So, other than Mexico, the main Latin American countries which have been recipients of Chinese migrants include Cuba, Peru, and Brazil. If, in all these countries, the Chinese suffered from ill treatment, the intensity of the violence against them varied. The largest massacre of Chinese, alongside Torreon, is one that happened in Cañete, in Peru, at the end of the 19th century, when Chinese migrants clashed with local farmers of Indian and African descent, resulting in the massacre of between 500 and 1,500 Chinese over a few weeks. As happened later in Torreon or in the US West Coast, it was first other poor workers which turned against the Chinese, seen as advancing at their expense. Incidentally, for the same reason, violence would happen against Asian Americans during the Los Angeles riots in 1992. Violence committed by another colored minority, feeling a sense of displacement by newly arrived Asians. Interestingly, like would happen in Mexico later, when some Chinese sided with the Americans in their clash with Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa, some Chinese also sided with the foreign army of Chile against their Peruvian masters in the War of the Pacific in the late 19th century, for which they also faced resentment. In all these cases, resentment from the local laborers was directed not towards their common landlords, but towards the Chinese. If violence against the Chinese often started among oppressed laborers, it also quickly became institutional, with populist governments in Latin America quickly adopting anti-Chinese laws, like had happened in the United States. In the 1920s, the Mexican government adopted harsh anti-Chinese laws in the north of the country, similar to those of California 50 years earlier, laws which were replicated word by word by the Peruvian government a few years later. In Brazil and Cuba, no massacres of the same magnitude as Torreon or Cañete were recorded by historians. In Cuba, for example, the Chinese participated in the Cuban Revolution alongside the revolutionaries and were later rewarded for that, the opposite of what had happened in Mexico.
So what's the state of the Chinese today in Mexico? Besides all the Chinese manufacturers and investors, are there still many Chinese residing in Mexico? And does the past history still resonate today?
So it's a complex answer. So the descendants of the few Chinese who stayed in Mexico are now completely assimilated into Mexican society, including Funchuk and Hing's descendants. Facing this exclusion, the few remaining Chinese, they had decided to hide their origins and totally blend in, by their mixed marriages, for example, and by a complete acculturation into Mexico. Hing, for example, changed his name from Leong to Leon and forbid his younger children to learn Chinese. As China was undergoing its own revolution and it was affected by political upheavals, he believed that Mexico was their only future. There is also an amnesia from the whole community, people preferring to forget those years of exclusion and racism. Besides, migrants remained optimists. That was their only way to survive, thinking that those massacres would not happen again, and hence making their memory superfluous. Like in the US, the remaining Chinese community also lacked the critical mass to allow for it to reproduce itself, instead being condemned to complete assimilation. Like in the US, Mexico did not have so many Chinatowns where the Chinese could live amongst themselves. By contrast, until the Second World War, many Chinese in the US continued to live and marry amongst themselves, teaching their children Chinese, knowing that they would later be forced to work in Chinatown or have better opportunities going back to China. Today, the descendants of those early Chinese migrants in Mexico are only a quarter or an eighth Chinese by blood, having lost much links to China, but yet remaining proud of their heritage. The closing of China for almost 4 decades did not help either those Chinese to keep a link with their country of origin. I've spoken with a few Mexican Chinese activists today. The other ones who highlighted to me that voluntary amnesia was still a feature of many leaders in Mexico. In recent history, civil servants have tried to erase some facts about Torreon in history books, and attempts to memorialize Chinese history were vandalized in Torreon. The Mexican census today still does not recognize nor tracks the many different minorities in the country. This may be due to the fact that Mexico sees itself as a mixed-race and tolerant country, making those distinctions unnecessary. The country believes that it has put this problem of racism behind him, as more than 70% of its population is of mixed blood. Mexico may also have a problem conceptualizing that victims of racism can themselves be perpetrators of racism. Nonetheless, as you mentioned earlier, it is also remarkable that in 2011, 110 years after the Terror massacre, the Mexican president asked for forgiveness from the Chinese in an official ceremony with the Chinese ambassador present. There is now, as you noted, a new wave of Chinese migrants in Mexico, attracted by economic opportunities. Chinese being the third immigrant group in the country, like they were more than a century ago. China has also become Mexico's second largest trading partner, far behind the US, but with an increasing share. Chinese are building factories all over Mexico, in part to circumvent US anti-trade laws. Finally, Chinese illegal migrations to the US via Mexico has also jumped in recent years. Like a century ago, it seems that Mexico may be used again as a bridge by the Chinese to the United States. Like before, those new migrants are also displacing locals economically, and tensions have been highlighted in the recent press. It is unlikely, though, that this turns out into the same violence as before, but it is important, I think, for both Mexicans and Chinese to learn about their history together.
Yeah. Were there any challenges or obstacles you faced in your research of this book?
Yes, it was difficult for various reasons. First, the two main protagonists of the book each died 70 years ago, and none of their children were alive at the time of writing. I had to understand their personalities through scattered documents and memories of relatives. Another challenge I faced was the global amnesia which the Mexican Chinese community suffers from, no one being too keen to remember those years of exclusion. The third difficulty was the lack of critical historical narratives in Mexico. Unlike in the United States, in official text, most politicians of that time are described as nation founders and heroes, purposely hiding the political violence and corruptions of those days. I had to dig out into out-of-print books, academic theses, or old newspapers to find references to some of the events that had happened at the start of the century. Some of the same political violence continues in Mexico today, and one wonders if a better understanding and teaching of its history might help the country better deal with that violence. On the other hand, I was also helped in the case of my ancestors. As they had been successful, they had left traces of their passage behind them, like letters, articles, and photographs. Also, over the last 2 decades, historians started investigating the history of the Chinese in Mexico, many from US universities, their academic work allowing me to glue together my scattered family memories.
Well, I'm glad to have come across your book. Reading about the history through the experiences of your family brought this period to life. And I'll have links to the book in the show notes. So I thank you for coming on the China History Podcast to enlighten us about your family, who were part of this history. We keep hoping we'll learn from these past lessons in history and not be doomed to keep repeating them. So thank you, Hugo.
No, thanks, Laszlo. Muchas gracias for inviting me to the podcast. I really enjoyed it very much.
De nada. Okay, that's going to be it for this episodio especial. Once again, the book is called America's Lost Chinese, The Rise and Fall of a Migrant Family Dream. I'd like to thank Mr. Hugo Wong once again for coming on the CHP, and I thank all of you for listening. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California, inviting you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.